you're good. I'll be very quiet now. Okay, yeah. Very good.
Lunch.
Is the mic hot? The mic. Every visiting artist have a new one. Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's talk, this lunch hour talk with Jade Yumang. My name is Blair Fornwald, and I'm the director curator at the School of Art. And on behalf of the gallery, I'm really happy to welcome you all to this talk, which is being held in conjunction with Jade's solo exhibition, Next Door, Around the Corner, Inside the Bathhouse, By the Sea and Back. It's a good title. Jade's exhibition is going to open with a reception tonight, which will be from 5 till 8 p.m. I think it's a really stunning exhibition. It's very conceptually tight, and it's really visually rich and stunningly well crafted. So I'm really excited for everyone to see it, and I hope you can join us tonight to celebrate. Before I introduce Jade, I want to acknowledge that we are on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininewek, Eshninewek, Dakota Eote, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. Our presence on this land is sustained by drinking water from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and with electricity generated by the Nelson River on Tatasquiac Fox Lake, York Factory, and War Lake First Nations. The city of Winnipeg takes its name from the Anishinaabe and Inuit name Winnipe or Muddy Water, and it is located at the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, a site that has served as a meeting place for over 6,000 years. In 1871, Treaty 1 was signed here at Lower Fort Garry, taking land from 7 First Nations and making it available for settler use and ownership. It should be noted, though, that the land, water, and resources were not ceded, that First Nations signatories agreed in the spirit of peace and friendship to share the land, water, and resources for the mutual benefit of all. And yet, with each wave of settlement, Indigenous people were displaced from their traditional lands and ways of life. The Indian Act of 1876 stripped Indigenous people of their rights and liberties, separated families via the residential school system, and severed Indigenous people's connections to their land and culture. We acknowledge not only that Indigenous people have faced historical oppression, but that they continue to experience harm through deeply rooted and widespread colonialist systems and ideologies that impact every facet of contemporary life. Today, as you know, Winnipeg is a richly multicultural city with the largest Indigenous community in Canada per capita. It's also home to settlers and immigrants who made their way here either in this generation or in previous generations, often escaping oppression themselves, as well as descendants of African ancestors who arrived on Turtle Island involuntarily. Today, Tagalog is the third most common spoken language, and 35% of Winnipeggers identify as members of a visible minority. The School of Art Gallery is committed to working with and alongside Indigenous artists and communities, and to programming work that addresses the complex legacies and ongoing harms of settler colonialism, which I think are subjects that inform Jade's work and research and are also addressed in Elizabeth Milton's video. The bottom of the pool is painted turquoise, which is also opening tonight. Reconciliation and decolonization efforts benefit all of us, creating a culture of racial, gender, and class equity, good environmental stewardship, safety, care, and respect. And as a settler descendant and a representative of an artistic and educational institution, it is a tremendous privilege to live here and work here alongside my Indigenous colleagues, friends, and community members in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I am personally and professionally very grateful. I also just want to acknowledge the generous support that the gallery receives from the University of Manitoba, the School of Art, and all of the faculty, staff, donors, and volunteers who make our work possible. Big thanks to the gallery's fantastic team, Donna Jones, C.W. Brooks-Ip, Glenn Johnson, Sapphire Morose, Jordan Anglin, Sid Caldwell, Amy Giesbrecht, Lauren McNaughton, and Zoe Libran, as well as to the School of Arts Media and Events Coordinator, Kaylin Harrison, who has helped make this programming possible. Thank you also to Josh and Teddy from Information Services and Technology, and to our fabulous team of interpreters, Shannon and Christina, who are both here to make this talk more accessible and more widely available to other members of the community. And of course, I really want to thank Jade for coming tonight, or this afternoon and also tonight, for sharing their thoughts and their work with us. Jade Yumang was born in Quezon City in the Philippines, grew up in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and then immigrated to unceded Coast Salish territories, aka Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and they are now living in the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires in Chicago, Illinois. They've exhibited their work at several museums and galleries, both internationally and nationally, and have received grants from the Illinois Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the BC Arts Council. Jade has been artist in residence at the Fire Island Artist Residency, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center, the Swing Space Residency, and the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. And they earned their MFA from the Parsons School of Design and BFA from the University of British Columbia, both with honors. And Jade is an associate professor in the Department of Fiber and Material Studies at the School of Art Institute in Chicago. And you've just been really such a delight, so pleasurable, so organized, great to work with. So thank you so much. And please help me in welcoming Jade.
Thanks, Blair. I feel like I'm going to do karaoke right now. I have a mic in front of me. Okay. Again, thanks, Blair, for getting me here and the amazing team it was so wonderful and smooth. And also wonderful to see all the grad students I met. Was it yesterday? Yesterday. Miriam is here, Frankie, and then Lisha and Layla as well. So yeah, I'll start. Okay, so as mentioned, I was born in the Philippines in Quezon City within Metro Manila and named after my mother's beauty salon, and grew up there for the first 7 years of my life. I haven't been back since, but I remember having a sense of queer space before knowing what that meant. I was surrounded, this is a blurry photo, surrounded by folks who spoke the local gay lingo on top of Tagalog, Kapampangan, which is my parents' dialect, and English. And I was that kid in the beauty parlor arranging the nail polish by color and the acrylic nails by size that you see here in the case. That was my work. First installation work right there. And at that time, I was also shaped with the experience of my parents being part of the People Power Revolution, also known as the Philippine Revolution of 1986, to topple the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. But it was also still unstable, and my parents looked for financial stability elsewhere after the dictatorship. So we then moved to Dubai, UAE, and then we lived there for 9 years, thinking that it would be more of a stable place to raise a kid. But there was, of course, the Gulf War in 1990, 1991, as UAE was part of the coalition, and American and British troops had bases there. Then, well, I was an emo kid, but had the opportunity to immigrate to Vancouver, Canada in the 90s, became Canadian, and in more peaceful times had room to think about my sense of queerness, at least a language around it. Going to the Queer Center after high school, went dancing a lot at the gay club there called the Odyssey, and that's also where I met my partner. To then spending time in New York for grad school, and then eventually landing in Chicago in 2018. And the reason I'm sharing this is not really about sentimentality. Instead, it's about never completely being rooted to one thing, yet still having a through line of queerness in different stages, and had to constantly adapt and morph in order to belong, to fit in, and also to survive. And I'm proud to be all of this, and I'm very much entangled with what it is to be queer as a kid in a predominantly Roman Catholic environment, as a tween in a Muslim environment, a teenager and young adult in Canada, and as an artist and educator in the US. And aside from growing up in places where, there's still no legal protections being queer in the Philippines, punishable by death in the UAE, to then being protected in Canada. And I was about to say the US, but I don't know right now. But yeah, it's always departing from one origin to the next is something that is inherent in how I work. And at those pivotal moments of identity formation, never feeling completely rooted to one thing culturally, one thing that's consistent is a sense of queerness as a through line. So what does the cultural construct of queerness through a transmigrant experience look like? And this is one of my favorite scholars, Martin F. Manalansan IV, from a book, Queer Diasporas, and I quote, "In a world where identity is not rooted or territorialized within a specific place, rituals become the signs at the crossroads." So what does it mean? And even what does it look like when what grounds you the most or where you feel more secure is also something always shape-shifting as well, with a foundation that is purposefully unstable. In one way, I was taught to assimilate and comply to be understood, but queerness reminds me to play, resist, persist, and flourish instead. And I'm concerned with the trajectory of how queer bodies are used, of what is visible, and how this is constantly being questioned of its physical and concrete existence. In some ways, nothing has changed. And I'm concerned, or in a lot of ways, it's a form of abstraction that's from a corporeal and material source. It's also a way to think about it as an action. What are you abstracting from? And for me, those rituals that Manalansan mentions as signs at the crossroads is that of repetition in my work, both in its seriality and repetitive nature of craft and performance. And I'll be going through several bodies of work, and we'll show you just a selection from each series. So for this series called Thumb Through, it's based on a gay erotic magazine from the late 60s, early 70s, consisting of 32 sculptures. And the magazine was part of a legal scandal in 1972 in New Jersey, where cops without warrant entered a bookstore owned by Edward Shapiro and Milton Nirenberg and seized various curiosa that were deemed obscene. So these are some of the images or the pages from that magazine. And during the court case, the state refused to return the magazine, comparing it to a loaded gun. So the case language makes no other mention of the magazine's sexual content aside from their so-called obscene nature. And these notions of speaking around bodies and transforming desire into something harmful are at the center of the series. And there are in total 32 pages in the magazine, which are then scanned and then printed on cotton fabric and turned into sculptures. So each sculpture represents a page and matched with textiles and notions from that era. Now, I was given this magazine during my time at a residency in Fire Island, which I'll talk a little bit later. And a lot of my work back then was cutting up magazines and going through archives in different cities, and was stunned at the really beautiful layout of the pages and how the models were floating from one colorful background to the next. And I'm really honored as well that this was featured in several places, most notably at Des Moines Arts Center, which then traveled to the Nerman Museum. And it was curated by Jared Ledesma, which is the first of its kind at the Des Moines Arts Center, focusing on queer subject matter. So consistent throughout the series is the repetitive shape grouped together to create the whole of each sculpture. And what appealed to me is the one rule of sewing a straight stitch with a quick curve at the tip, and then repeating that again and again to use 1 yard of the printed fabric to accumulate some type of form. So that accumulation became the component or main component for each sculpture as a way to obfuscate the body, but clearly it's still winking back at you. And also to help the viewer see the works through first the surface of the techniques. And here I'm using notions and trims such as the fringe and rope as a way to fall into the optics of the printed image and into its haptic quality. That notion of touch in relation to the materials used parallels that of the magazine as you lick your finger and thumb through its 32 shiny pages. you encounter two men undressing page by page until they are locked in embrace. So here, using familiar textiles such as the mesh typically used for baseball caps or trucker hats, or knitted ribbing, typically used for the lower edges of the sweaters, on sleeve cuffs and necklines, or mesh to cool the body, and zippers to close or release the body. Ooh. Uh, or woven wool to warm the body brings it really back to the initial desires of touch intended by the magazine and abstracting it away from the fear imposed by the state. I'm a bit of a quote queen, apologies. As you can see, repetition is a force for me in order to embody optics. A pivotal text is Gilles Deleuze's Difference in Repetition, and I quote, repetition is a condition of action before it is a concept of reflection. End quote, I'll end there. And I'm using moments in history that are untold and unspoken and unseen in the main heteronormative narrative to understand difference in of itself, of queerness specifically as limitless and producing many points of reference rather than reproducing the same narrative. And for me, it's all about creating new muscle memory when it comes to techniques. Once I learn and repeat something, and I always, for me, remind my students this when I teach a new technique, at first you have to pay attention, repeat what's given, do your samples, but eventually it becomes second nature, and you start making your own version. And when I'm in the studio, I make small samples as a way to access the subconscious. Some people say it's mindless, but it's really letting go of judgment and letting the body talk. And eventually the body and mind adjust and something within that repetition deviates. So sometimes I actually do use my body and others to address this issue through endurance as a repetitive device in order to meld into the material. So significantly, I wanted to see queer bodies at rest or in reckless abandon. And this was my first attempt, made up of hand-cut paper and accompanied by a performance or anti-performance where I am induced with the aid of sleeping pills for 6 hours, the best performance ever. And a lot of these works are performance of refusal, absolving the queer body to constantly announce themselves, but instead give in and be consumed by their desires or transform those fears into something transgressive. And for example, for this one, had the opportunity to take this further when I did the residency at Fire Island Artist Residency. I hold this residency close to my heart, and it's the first of its kind to give space for queer artists and now poets as well. It's located in an island in New York State that has two hamlets that have a really rich, complicated queer history. Going there, the world was flipped. Everyone was very, very queer. And we all felt we can kind of let our hair down. Well, metaphorically for me. So for example, in this performance, in the Sunken Forest, I give people direction to find me in a secluded area, to have queer bodies cruise and be part of the land, and left trails of tiny talon-like sculptures until they discovered me encased in a pod. And then I got out of that and went straight to the water until I was submerged and then held my breath and then re-emerged again. And then walked back to the land to throw a bouquet-like sculpture to my audience. Total drama queen. So in this performance with Nick Chaffin, we acted as spirits guiding onlookers to follow us in the magical sex forest of Fire Island, where active sexual encounters are aplenty, while also being aware that the very same ground is also where ashes of queer people, particularly gay men who died of AIDS in the 80s and 90s, were scattered. So here history is layered and active. For this series, I've been tackling one simple gesture, the smile, and try to break it down literally and figuratively to see the decay of that surface. Uh, on a side note, I was just telling Blair I was in male beauty pageants as a kid and was taught to smile a certain way. So for a year, I was practicing to hold a smile for an hour, which meant practicing in the morning and at night, a lot of smiling. And then I recorded that smile and wanted to really capture the moment it turns into a kind of grotesque scene. And then projected that on drywall to literally destroy it even further. Here performed with Daniel Morowitz, where we literally break the smile by nailing and hammering the wall while a playlist of songs about smiles were playing. This is another reiteration of that. I'll play a little video. And the nails are attached to the strings that are attached to a handmade costume I was wearing. And then I pull away, the costume is attached to the wall, and then leave the space ending the performance. And then the video and costume becomes a record of that event and stands as a sculpture. Whew, okay. I turned back for a second to talk about techniques and craft. This is a great book by Glenn Adamson, Craft. And I quote, "Craft only exists in motion. It is a way of doing things, not a classification of objects, institutions, or people," end quote. I'm not wedded to a particular tool and or technique, but instead look at my use of different modes of making as a polyamorous approach and being committed to many craft forms, but not necessarily um, creating a normative lineage. Instead, traversing different space of making. I learned earlier on in terms of how my identity was constantly being uprooted and destabilized, and that the most stable aspect is also the most unstable in its pliability and softness. Okay, let's go in the shadows for a second. For this series, it started off really when I was binge watching a lot of film noir movies on a miserable rainy day in Vancouver, which was almost every day there. And I used to do that as well with my mom when I was young. And rewatching these films with kind of shady glasses as an adult, I had a perspective on why I was so attached specifically to the villains in these films, especially characters such as Waldo Lydecker, played by the enigmatic Clifton Webb, who had a way of enunciating every syllable with a stern yet effeminate undertone. I mean, clearly I'm influenced. So these characters had a queer undertone, as I mentioned. Most of the movies are adaptations from novels where the characters are explicitly queer. But in the movies, directors had to be more subtle due to the Hays Code, which is a strict movie moral code in the 40s and 50s that had really strict guidelines of what is considered acceptable. So you have to read between the lines here where queerness is considered a perversion. But what happens when these really flamey characters are imprinted visually and also literally in highly flammable nitrite film? So the queer subtext is very present despite those restrictions. And again, how do these subtle moments in film bounce back to a queer person watching this, whether during that era or in my case, later as a teen? For me, I wanted to really look at them with a sympathetic lens and figure out their background story of why they are portrayed as such. So most of these films are built on deceptive characters amidst a dizzying environment, not just in its skewing of perspective through the use of shadows and lights, patterns, but the overall effect visually is this flattening of the ground. But I wanted to make them in the round, seeing the depth and figuring out what's underneath these characters. And within the series, I really wanted to give them a redemption story where they clap back, they languish, have complex and rewarding relationships. And I also wanted to embody the movements and cut the film where the characters are played in a loop so they don't die. Spoiler alert, they either die or end up miserable. But here they are projected through a permeable sculpture that spreads throughout the room. I also had the opportunity to have performers complicate these characters further at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York through abstracted movement to manifest these specters of queerness through flesh. Uh, it was a 2-hour performance where Alvaro and Sarah moved along the shadow and light, where they donned handmade layers of costumes until they cannot move anymore. So this was an installation envisioning that further. I used 2 light sources, 1 light bulb, and the projector projecting the films where the characters are cut and looped to light the whole exhibition and use shadows as actual medium. So this casted amazing shadows from satin banners I made where I used a Deveray technique, which is a technique that burns out the cellulose part of the satin to reveal images within that fabric. I love the music. Okay, so aside from my solo practice, I'm part of a collaboration as well called Tatlo, which means 3 in Tagalog, with Sarah Jimenez, formerly with Michael Watson. We are known initially for a lot of endurance performance work where we push our bodies to the limit through either repetitive movements, typically in a long period of time, like 24 hours. For example, in this video performance called Bridal Dance Bulaklakan is a one-take video performance where we created a choreography inspired by traditional Filipino dances that involve objects. The objects become performative sculptural props that are meant to hinder and inform our movements. It's based on a really graceful floral dance, but the objects here are altered by making them primarily out of cement to challenge and weigh down our movements. And the dance was further transformed in the rough terrain of the lava fields in Eugene, Oregon, as the ground was quite unstable. This performance is based on Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, The United States and the Philippine Islands, which was written in 1899 at the beginning of the Philippine-American War. In the poem, Kipling, who wrote Jungle Book, promotes the idea that the US should acquire colonies such as the other European nations. And in this piece, we performed a poetic gesture of literally internalizing and embodying these words. The poem is printed on a long strip of fabric that we consumed, so it's in our mouths the whole time, and then revealed through our mouths while we pull away, and then wrapped our faces, binding us and making us blind and mute for that moment. And through this gesture, we're really interested in the legacy of imperialism on the psyche and the body, passed on from generation to generation, and a mode to break that cycle. And this is one of our last performances before the pandemic, called Weighted Weight, which elaborates through movement how relationships, friends, lovers, family members, colleagues fluctuate between exchanges of care and burden as we take turns dragging and hugging each other. And I miss working with Sarah. It's been quite integral in terms of really thinking about the force of repetition in a physical and immediate sense. And we're actually looking forward to performing again this December in Miami. So within this series, I wanted to make a group of kind of eccentric creatures cut from the same cloth, but each one expresses a slight difference through embellishments. And I wanted to make a group of work using piecing and quilting as the driving force for this series. And the series is based on a publication, gay publication called Drum, founded in 1964 by Clark Polak, who wanted to be the gay Hugh Hefner of his time, but with activism in mind. So Drum was a popular publication pushing for radical sexual politics and was widely distributed in the US and abroad. It differed from other gay and lesbian publications of the time as it flagrantly blended sexuality, politics, literature, and humor. Other contemporary publications at that time were advocating for more conservative views of sameness in order to be accepted or tolerated, and were not really fond of Clark Polak's brash approach. And I had the opportunity to access that particular queer archive in Philly, where they have a complete Clark Polak drum collection and documents and letters on Clark. So now at that time, it was illegal again to mail obscene materials, and the post office, customs, and the FBI collaborated to arrest Polak for selling and distributing Curiosa, which led to his prosecution. And I happen to have one of the copy of the issues that were seized by the post office that led to his arrest. Now, the quilting for me is this idea of piecing together scraps to remake and to serve another purpose, or to create a memorial of a loved one. And going to the important archives such as the one I went to, you're really confronted by the fragments of queer history. The process of scanning each page, printing them on cotton, cutting and piecing them, and then quilting them and cutting them again, and forming them into sculptures is really important for me to make sense of how history is written. These sculptures are matched with contemporaneous textiles from that time, such as corduroy, denim, still timeless, and sometimes adorned with striped knit tape, used for trims and hats, bags, and also jock straps. An important note as well is that the photographs of men in the publication are limited to 3 semi-nude solo images that don't really engage in sex for the cover page, centerfold, and back cover. And the rest of it is primarily text, consisting of comics, personal ads, stories, editorials, and news relating to queer politics. In some way, he was a precursor to ACT UP and Queer Nation, disseminating news and also spurring queers to fight back. Now, that text to image ratio is the most interesting part to me, as the images were a venue into more pressing issues laid out in the text. So those images, those texts were made for the gay gaze, but it also triggered enough of a counter reaction for the FBI to indict Polak for obscenity. Although more than that, reading behind these bodies and words were revolutionary ideas of a radical queer politics developing, which is the most threatening as it tries to validate desire as a political act. So for this series, I was really looking at how someone's hope for a queer future was quickly derailed, especially when queer politics was just simmering in the 60s. But even though it was short-lived, it was enough of a ripple effect for others to repeat and make their own path. Another great book, Gayatri Gopinath, and I quote, "The queerness of the text resides in its refusal of origins, its insistence on the impossibility of tracing lineage and accessing the past through bloodlines, genealogy, or conventional historiography." And Gayatri further calls upon looking at history with a queer optic, which is given a plurality, which is a hard thing for me to say, of how history is embodied. And I quote, "The queer optic deviates from a forward-looking directionality and instead veers toward multiple objects, spaces, and temporalities simultaneously." So the act of adding on or everything but the kitchen sink is a way to create dizzying pathways rather than a limited narrative. To remix what is given is a way to question our position and a way to disorient. Which leads me to this body of work that dissolves time and place through the making of multiple objects. I was looking at the first written articles of queer domesticity in the mainstream in Canada and the US that came out independently from each other in the same year in 1964. The first one in Canada in Maclean's magazine called The Homosexual Next Door. And then the other one, Homosexuality in America in Life magazine. The Canadian one projecting a bit more of a sympathetic light, and the American one having a residual undertone from the McCarthy era, comparing homosexuals to communists and labeling them a problem. So interestingly, in these magazines and other lifestyle magazines from that era were advertisements of vinyl floor tiles that are littered in its pages. One of which is aptly called Gay Spatter. And I was like, okay, that was really easy. What should I do with this? So I used these samples as a jumping point and created my own pattern, which is then printed on cotton and wallpaper as materials for the series. And here I employ different techniques that hints on the home, such as curtains or waffle weave technique, typically used as a towel, or use trapunto technique, which is a form of stuffed quilting to raise certain areas of the quilt. Here, images are embedded to create obscure patterns. And here's another example of that in detail. So unlike the previous sculptural series where the bodies are obscured within the print, here bodies are partially formed. This is intended because when I go back to the figure, I don't want it to be an idealized form. My work is really about the cycle of representation of the body and needs to kind of sit in multiple levels of becoming to avoid creating a standard or idealized way of looking at the body. So both articles really create this binding scenario where queerness can only be seen within the confines of a suburban setting, a place where even the nuclear family at that time really cannot sustain. So queer people were already also expelled from that place already and moved either to the city or back to the land. But here, even for me, the loose knit and the very kind of narrow quilt serve no utilitarian function anymore, as it acts as an ornamentation, as residues. And I'm also trying to reimagine them as haunting the home. And instead of being stepped on, the vinyl flooring transforms corporeally to kind of slither back into the home and interested in that slippage between the interior of the skin and the skin of the body. So for example, I use wood flat reeds, typically used for basket making, and then use them as modes of display where the bodies are stuck and suspended. You also notice woven items that act as rags, rugs, towels, and scarves in some of the sculptures. Here is the waffle weave again, appear and casually placed in the sculpture where the fringe act as body fluids, adding on to the spatter pattern of the wallpaper. You'll also notice knives appear as well in the work. As I shift again to the figure, I'm also looking at horror films from that era laden with queer anxiety. So I incorporate dust ruffles and use them primarily as I shift to the figure. Um, and also in between places where hands and feet peek under. So here the dust ruffles are stuck on or stack on top of one another to act as tiered stages for the bodies. So some of the movies I was watching during that era was like Orgy of the Dead, Frankenstein Created Woman, Dr. Jekyll's Sister Hyde, The Vampire Lovers, which is great, The Daughters of Darkness, and The Blood Spattered Bride, just to name a few. Uh, And I wanted to pause for a moment, thinking back to feeling out of place and displaced as a queer person. Here I'm looking at it specifically in the domestic, particularly the suburbs. But it's one way for me on reflecting how queer bodies are orienting to places of belonging or creating spaces within spaces that have forced them out. Sarah Ahmed in Queer Phenomenology really aptly talks about this, and I quote, "For bodies that are out of place in the spaces in which they gather, the experience can be disorienting. You can feel oblique after all. You can feel odd, even disturbed. Experiences of migration or of becoming estranged from the contours of life at home can take this form." And I wanted to use this transgressive nature of horror with that of how queer lives are constantly questioned or dictated through a biased system. Alongside body parts, you'll also notice I'm using organs, specifically the heart. Much like the system of the house, which I consider a body as well, here I look at it more as bodies producing simultaneously within an existing body. But here, these severed figures are reanimated to renovate and redecorate the interior. Uh, but because it's modular, it can also be disassembled and rearranged. At the same time, they're also within a matrix that produces a particular kind of domestic kinship. So does the home define the body? Does the body define the home, or are they in tandem? I had the opportunity as well to produce a space that reconstructs the home and had some of these sculptures, which was part of a group show at Kohler Art Center in 2021 called High Touch, curated by Katie Johnson. And the team at Kohler was really amazing in constructing these different level plinths painted in colors based on the tiles and floating wall pieces covered in wallpaper. And the construction is based on the facade of a typical 60s ranch house, here flipped on its side to be experienced in a different way. And also had the fun challenge to make work that flat packs. I was also looking at a lot of early flat pack furniture gaining popularity during this time. And the goal was to just have one box to ship, which then expands in 2 rooms here at the Circa Art Actuel in Montreal. I'm almost there, people. Hold on. Okay, so what happens when you surrender? One thing that I love about a lot of fiber techniques is that it requires tension. Eventually, you have to release that tension and you get something soft and pliable. Just like the body, you hold tension uh, and you yearn for some type of release, which is acupuncture for me nowadays. But much like the word yield, which can mean either to surrender or relinquish, to give away under physical force, or it can also mean to bear or bring forth, to produce, to generate. Fiber techniques, just like the body, can absorb force, but it can heal, it can be transformed, produced, mended in different ways of being. Which leads me to this current work that you'll see in the show. I've been looking at the tradition of fish nets in the Philippines, especially these types of bamboo nets, framed nets that were designed for one body, or these amazing lift nets to either catch fish or shrimp, and love its really elegant structure, especially how temporary it is because of at any point this can be destroyed during the typhoon season, but can easily be rebuilt again. And alongside those nets, I've been investigating a popular gay porn actor in the 90s, 2000s, Brandon Lee, last quote of the day, by Nguyen Tan Wang, in a context dominated by white American masculine physical perfection. What is it about Brandon that has enabled him to enter into the segregated world of mainstream gay pornography? I propose that Brandon's crossover is made possible by a certain degree of racial instability accruing to his star image. And for Brandon Lee, he created this American boy next door persona that does not really mention or use Asian stereotypes that were endemic at that time. He happens to be Filipino, but that was never mentioned or played upon during his fame. So I've been really experimenting, looking at his images, particularly the optics of what he was kind of pushing through the screen, and then using net techniques. So each net is hand knotted one at a time that you see here. And then it's stretched, and then I do an embroidery technique on through the grid. So filet lace was introduced to the Philippines via Spanish missionaries through colonization. And this was developed further in the Philippines, primarily using cotton or piña fiber or pineapple fiber, primarily the fiber from the leaves. And then later adapted for American soldiers stationed in the islands to bring back home as a souvenir during World War II, where these were made. And in the Philippines, there's already a rich tradition of embroidery techniques by way of Spain, but also a netting tradition before that. And I want to look at the optics of Brandon as a constructed, ambiguous Asian character and how this tablecloth's layered history might act as a permeable material for me to embody. And typically the motifs embedded in filet lace are religious, geometric, mythological, or pastoral. Craftspeople follow and perfect an enforced pattern, but sometimes these designs fracture and deviate into new stories. So both endure in kind of multiple histories and unfixed identities, and I aim to mesh them together. As I mentioned, filet lace is this kind of open work textile using netting as its base for an embroidered image or pattern. But in my work, I embroider typically a blank square where an image of Brandon Lee is imprinted within the fiber using dye sublimation. And the yarn and the fabric as well are all hand dyed. So recently, the process of subtractive and editing dye work as well that I use in the series, and the patterns as well for the soft sculptures are developed from Brandon Lee's sex scenes, where his body is bifurcated and stretched to render new abstract forms. And also making a large scale net tapestry. Every time I see this, oh, what did I do? This is done right now in 2 feet by 2 feet squares with a repeat background motif and images of Brandon Lee. And the rise of Brandon Lee was also on the cusp of the internet in the 90s when his imagery was extended through people's private screens into a grid of pixels. So using the fillet lace as a screen as well, the resolution of the images is shifted in scale and tactile materiality of the technique, which kind of brings it in and out of focus. So each net is individually hand knotted and then embroidered for this one using a twist weaving technique. And you'll see a bit of that in the show, which will then be stitched together to make a 10 feet by 32 feet tapestry. And I've only completed 12 out of 80, but wish me luck on that one. Thank you.
I'm going to hop on
It's like a
over.
mic on mic.
Hello, I'm going to hop on over to the secondary mic.
I feel like we're gonna do a rap battle
Hey,
right now.
oh my God. I don't know if I'm up for that. But this is the microphone with which I would ask anybody in the room that has a question to ask it into this microphone, and that would be for the benefit of folks who are joining us remotely, so that they could hear your questions too. So does anybody have any questions for, I was going to say for Brandon Lee.
For Brandon Lee, I
For
know.
Jade.
I have a lot of questions for Brandon Lee.
Oh my God, as do I. Does anyone have any questions? And if there are any questions, if you're joining us on YouTube and you have any questions, those can come up through the chat and I can bring that up and bring them to the room. Okay, I can ask a question. I can ask a question
Okay.
and maybe get the party started or who knows. First of all, I want to say like thank you for the really excellent reading list. I think this is a really kind of great place to start thinking about queerness and materiality and embodiment. One other thing that I was thinking about, two other things that I was thinking about. One is like gossip as a form of queer research. It seems like when you're talking about like sort of scandal and subtext
yes.
and I guess gossip is something I think about a lot, and the way that the language of like queer people and women is often like sort of suppressed, I think, by kind of claiming it as gossip and hearsay.
I mean, one thing that's really important for me specifically is going through, as I mentioned, queer archives. Right now, I'm taking my students actually, or just took my students to, and this class is called Queer World Making, to the Gerber Hart Archive in Chicago, which is the largest Midwest queer archive. And one thing that typically you encounter in a lot of these archives, usually they're not funded well, except for the one at Gerber Hart Archive, and they actually have a dedicated archivist. But a lot of these boxes are typically collected when they're thrown away by their family members who don't know what to do with their queer child or their queer relative. And then it's kept in this box, kind of loosely organized. And then the archivist, their job is to really piece things together. A lot of it is hearsay and gossip of like building who this person is, also in relation to what was happening at that time. Just like the one that I went to in Philly, I wanted to mainly look at those archives and see Clark Polak's letters, but the person I met, the archivist, actually knew Clark Polak.
Oh, wow.
And he gave me gossip, which really kind of fed to the work even more. And the thing is, even when I teach that class with my co-teacher, queer history is always going to be erased, and a lot of these archives are there for a reason. And in some ways, gossip is there to kind of carry that forward, because it's never going to be usually imprinted in terms of history. So
Right. That's not who's writing history. Like diasporic people,
right, exactly.
gender and sexual minorities.
Exactly.
Those are kind of histories that are maybe gossip and hearsay and scandal are kind of like the only ways to access or kind of piecing together.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the other text, if this is a two-parter, I think the other text that I was thinking a lot about while you were speaking was Svetlana Boym's The Future of Nostalgia, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where she really makes a distinction between like a form of nostalgia that kind of lives in the longing and the desire, and then a kind of a dangerous and propagandistic
Right.
nostalgia that that aims to reconstruct sort of an imagined past. And I've been thinking a lot about that text lately because of making America great again. America's never great.
Well, again, it's that fear, and it's actually happening, especially in Florida right now, in terms of a lot of board members in the education there have been replaced, and removing queer and Black history in a lot of the curriculum. So it's becoming real and spreading a lot in the U.S. What was the question again?
I don't know if I got to it, but
But,
I
in
guess,
terms of nostalgia.
yeah, and I think because of the way that you're working, I think both with textile techniques
And the longing, yeah.
textile techniques that have a certain amount of like sentimentality or nostalgia sort of
Okay.
embedded into them, and also looking at queer archives that are
Right.
and queer porn from the past where you're
Yes.
like, oh, these are glossy and beautiful and like
Yes.
tactile. And how do you kind of negotiate maybe a tricky relationship with
Yeah.
nostalgia?
No, I mean, there's definitely a fear of softening a very kind of fraught history. And again, like thinking of what Gerber Hart is doing right now is really contextualizing what they have. And they always kind of preface it of like, you're going to primarily see cis white men in this history. And they're, slowly bringing in different type of queer history. Or even just looking at the kind of I can't say that word, mythologizing of Stonewall. And a lot of people know Stonewall, but that actually Compton riots, just like that happened a few years before. And then a recent movie came out replacing, or the protagonist was a white cis
Right.
twink,
Right, right.
Again, like reframing that already. So historical amnesia is real. And a lot of these archives, they're kind of the residue there that people need to always give breath and make sense of every time. So it's really important,
Yeah.
but it's dangerous at the same time.
Right, but kind of making work. I think maybe the thing in your work is like you're kind of reviving some of these like stories and materials from the archive, but it seems like you're also kind of negotiating that complexity and kind of keeping it abstract.
Yeah.
And a little bit ambiguous or nebulous.
Yeah, and with my queer world making class, we just talk about there were so many infighting within the queer community then, which I think most young students don't know about. They think it's just this one monolith um, uh, community, but it's actually so many infighting just to kind of push for one way of being accepted or tolerated, especially in the US.
Thank you for indulging that very long
Yeah.
question. Does anybody else have any?
Yeah, Mario.
So, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Jade. Fantastic presentation. So I have a question about, you were talking about rituals and repetition in your work.
Yes.
And but in terms of presenting your work, I could see that the presentation is ritualistic
Yes.
as well. Like even in some of the sculptures, there are the steps that's, like creating a hierarchy.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can talk more about those, like the intention behind this, presentation type of presentation.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it comes to sculpture and installation, I think of it more in terms of how another body is reacting to that, going around the sculptures or circumambulating as a form of ritual. I mean, I grew up in a very kind of religious upbringing, and went to church, but I actually love all the rituals
Right.
of it. And you're just there on Sunday to sit down and reflect and do something repetitive
Right.
as a way to kind of get yourself out of your body.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, a lot of hopefully that work, or I use like different sight lines to kind of get you there. So for the show, for example, here, you enter and it kind of brings you down with the fabric. So it contracts you, and then you enter, you expand again,
Right.
but then you're contracted with those kind of optics of his face, usually on the wall, kind of like saints almost, and then you kind of kneel down again to see the abstracted forms of those soft sculptures.
Right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can bring it back to you if you'd like.
I love your toque.
Oh, thank you so much. From Cami Gertz.
Cami Gertz,
Cami
okay.
Gertz Studios, yes.
Okay.
Hey, so I've got a little something written. Winnipeg is a beautiful city full of rich culture, and here at the university, there is a space of appreciation for queer art and queer sexuality, but the space is somewhat small here, and there's also a lot of external and internal conservative ideology, which places pressure on queer folks to conform to heteronormative standards.
Yes.
You've worked in much larger cities, and yet here you are in Winnipeg.
Yes.
Do you feel a difference between speaking in a small Canadian city like Winnipeg and exhibiting in a place like New York? And does your work become outreach?
I love that question. I mean, I haven't been here for so long in Winnipeg, and I feel like I'm in a very kind of bubble in here. I mean, I always tell my students this. They always, there's a pressure to represent, right? But I always say, who are you winking at? What does the work doing for that maybe one person that needs to kind of be seen? So I always kind of think of it that way, or just my experience when I was a teenager in Vancouver, or 20, I should say. I looked like a teenager, but I was 20. And I saw my first, it was like from a curatorial grad student who had a queer show there. And I was like aghast that this is a thing. And that kind of got me thinking about my existence in the world and what I could do in terms of how to express myself or to create like a queer world making space for myself. I mean, yes, in New York, I had that kind of privilege of just, there was such a diversity within the queer art scene. So it oscillates from abstract, very kind of clean, to very messy performance work. But I like I have to think about this kind of notion of outreach, of like who sees the show and what they get out of this. Again, thinking of what it was like for me as an undergrad, seeing that queer art show and how that kind of catapulted me into the work that I'm doing now still. So I still think about that after 20 years or so. So yeah, but I have to think about that a little bit more and spend a bit more time in when I do have the day off tomorrow. So if you could recommend anything for me, that would be great.
Do we have any more questions? Maybe not. That was a really fulsome and kind of rich conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. And be sure to come tonight, 5 till 8. You can carry on the conversation with Jade and see this really great exhibition. I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.